All right, seniors. Some of you will get this now. Some of you will get it later. We want to go over Earth Abides for year 22 and the chapters that include Charlie and the trip around America. And you could snag your books. Your assignment today is pretty simple. Open up an email. Type down some notes of what we talked about today, whether you're watching it live or whether you're watching it later on today. I don't care either way. And just send me an email with what you heard, what we discussed. It's all good. And also, make sure you're reaching out to friends from class and making sure they know what's going on. Getting in touch with things, tools like Remind. So if you would grab your book, I'm going to start going over some pieces and give you some clues of things that you can send in an email. Firstly, we're going to start on page 147 in year 22, and it is a clue as to what George Stewart is saying basically about the book and most importantly about humanity. All right. He says, there must be in their social bond something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted of among us. He's talking about Native Americans. For thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those aborigines having from choice become European. The European way of life that was mentioned here by Jean de Crevecoeur in the early 1800s is talking about the European way of life, which is meant mercantilism, which is a form of early capitalism, and so it goes from there. And that obsession with conquest and movement and everything is something the Native Americans did not like, and they lived a more tranquil lifestyle, which, again, as you know, ultimately spells their doom. By the way, if you have any questions while we're doing this, feel free to send them in, okay? If you flip to 190, because we had already covered those chapters, I wanted to give you a preview of what's to come with the Golden Gate Bridge, right? On 190, he talks about the Golden Gate Bridge and how on the surface to the eye they had changed. The towers had hid their tops in the summer clouds, the mile-long dipping cables, the interlocked massive beams of steel. No longer they cast back the morning sun, the bright sheen of silver gray. The Golden Gate Bridge built during the Great Depression and was a pride of that era. And obviously in San Francisco, it's still a big deal. But he describes it all on 190 as now just basically the birds use it for a giant nest, okay? And what its purpose was is gone. And and he spends a lot of time talking about cars and their importance on the road and so on, and the development of man and our movements and everything. And on 191, he says, perhaps, he thought happily, this would be the day in which they would take the road again, not only in a car, literally, but also figuratively, the road toward the rebirth of civilization. He's planning on sending his sons out to find other forms of humanity that have survived. And you guys know that already. And they send him out, in the Jeep. Flipping to 193, description about a very dark view of capitalism and what capitalism entails, and it's in the calories. But on 193, he talks about how life is ruined by capitalism. But centuries flowed by, and then more of them, and many more things changed. Man invented civilization, and he was inordinately proud of it. But in no way did civilization change life more than by sharpening the line between work and play. And at last, that division came to be more important than the old one between sleeping and waking. Sleep came to be a thought of kind of relaxation, and sleeping on the job a heinous sin. The turning out of the light and the ringing of the alarm clock were not so much the symbols of man's dual life as were the punching of a time clock and the blowing of the whistle. Men marched on picket lines and threw bricks and exploded dynamite to shift an hour from one classification to the other, and other men fought equally hard to prevent them. And always work became more laborious and odious, and play grew more artificial and febrile. And he's really castigating capitalism, for driving us to worry about work and producing and products and so on and so forth. And in this particular time, we're seeing a great shift in our own society as we conduct class in this manner and discuss what is ultimately essential and non-essential. As we've already learned, it proves that apparently the most important product in civilization is toilet paper. The 195, they start talking about the Jeep and getting the Jeep. Jeep was a proud emblem of World War II when that's when they first came on the scene, and they began to be sold to the public thereafter. In fact, he goes into a store and steals a Jeep, or actually really steal it. The lot of discussion of the hammer. The hammer is everywhere. That's why we started today with the hammer. Okay. The description of the Jeep, the fact that they used it, and he sends his boys across the country. One of the things you send in today for is the symbolism of Joey. Make sure you type and send me the symbolism of Joey. Joey is the hope of the future. He is also the symbol of intellect. Okay, and think about the only one in the world who has any chance of bringing society one iota closer to what it used to be is Joey. And he is weak and ineffective. And ultimately, he ends up dying. And along with it, the hope of Isherwood at all, of rebuilding society. And I think Stewart is trying to express that in a form of symbolism. There is no, it is weak. This intellect in this modern world of post-apocalyptic plague, okay? And that all that matters is survival, and survival by the easiest means necessary. Nobody's really working real hard, okay? So send that about Joey. On 208 begins the transcontinental trip, okay? And, a little bit of discussion right beforehand about how Isherwood is trying to implement something and they want to do bull dodging. Nobody really wants to work hard, right? So in the trip across the country, the transcontinental trip, there's a lot of discussion about man-made objects that they cross, drive on, so on and so forth. Again, the pride of civilization, all of which are being overgrown now, right? A little bit of discussion about boundaries and the silliness of boundaries on 2010. He says the boundaries, like the fences, drew lines that were hard and uncompromising. They too were man-made, abstractions dominating reality. Where you crossed by the highway on a line, the road surface changed. It was smooth in Delaware, and when you went into Maryland, you felt a slight vibration. He goes on about that and talks about how they're all arbitrary. They're made up. In fact, post-World War II, there was a push to get rid of nationhood, another type of line, right, of boundaries. This is my country, that is your country. Because, you know, it was those boundaries and it was nationhood that led to World War I and II, and pretty much all the wars beforehand, or at least in immediate history. But boundaries fade even faster than fences. Imaginary lines need no rust to efface them. People are gone, civilization's gone, there are no boundaries. So just another another example of him criticizing man's, or civilization's belief in all of these arbitrary things that they've created. If you go on to chapter 5, which starts on 215, there's the resistance to education. Isherwood is trying to teach them how to carry on, math, science. He introduces them to music, to Beethoven with his record player. They don't care about any of it. They don't care about learning anything. And nothing of the old world is important, okay? And there are some pundits who begin to wonder how much our economy and our way of life will change after this shutdown and isolation. How many people will begin to look at the world differently, or how economies will shift, how our workday will shift? It'll be interesting to see if there is a more of a post-plague, pre-plague kind of mentality like it was with 9/11. But there's an interesting line on 218. He says the kids always wondered why 2 and 2 always made 4, and why not it could never be 5, which we cannot prove was an allusion to 1984, because 1984 and this book were written in the same year. So, and I've searched and have never been able to ascertain whether George Stewart was a fan of George Orwell. The on 219, there's a talk about the fact that the difference, the kids' perception of what Isherwood is versus the other men. Isherwood is a strange bird. He's always talking about things that people just don't understand. And there's always the discussion of the hammer, right? Another thing to talk about, in your notes today is that the hammer is all through this. There's the big moment in the book when Joey at school, or Isherwood's living room, is asked to, he actually goes and gets the hammer. He touches the hammer. The kids are afraid of the hammer, right? This is a big deal because Isherwood views this as superstition, and Isherwood hates superstition. Because as he points out, superstition leads to religion, and religion is what Stewart would review as anathema. He doesn't like religion. It's not science. You can't prove it. You can't necessarily touch it. It's faith, okay? And so he spends a lot of time in here in 222, 223, really beating on superstition, and while he's beating on superstition with his fist, he's kicking religion with his feet. And so you can mention that in your notes. But there's a lot of talk of that, and he reflects that with his characters that he does not like, that he shows them to be silly. And he's worried that this superstition over the hammer will turn into a religion, which, if you think about it, in the Judeo-Christian world, Christians use the crucifix, the cross, as a symbol of God and Jesus and religion. But the crucifix was a tool. It was an execution tool. You nailed somebody to it and left them to die. It's actually pretty grim if you think of it in that context. It's not very sunny. It's like having a religion based upon an electric chair, hanging that around your neck, okay? The 225 has a giant discussion about the hammer and superstition. In fact, he even contemplates melting it down, trying to find acid to destroy the hammer, to show them that there's nothing superstitious, nothing powerful about it. It's just a tool. That's the way Isherwood looks at it. It's a tool. These kids are taking it to another place. He's afraid that he'll be remembered later as Charles of the Hammer or Ish the Hammer, much like Thor. And on the bottom of 225, they talk about Charlemagne. They talk about the Franks, the Excalibur, so on and so forth, and all the superstition around King Arthur legends. He does not want that. He wants, he worries Joey will become a prophet, all right? Because he's putting all of his hope in the future into Joey. That's never a good idea. And then as we move on, we get to 231. And the foreshadowing of Joey's death is right here. And it screams the death of Joey. And then it's in the italics. He says, between the plan and the fulfillment lies always the hazard. The plan is Joey. Joey will take the next generation. He will take the hammer from Ish. And there's a hazard in the way, and it will eventually take him out. If you miss that, at the very end, it says, between the plan and the fulfillment stands always the frail barrier of a human life. The frail barrier here, the frailness, is Joey, right? Not going to survive in this apocalypse at all. 232, again, back to the superstition and the beginnings of religion. Sherwood does not want any religion coming out of this world. He says, not every day or every year could a man have reason to play with the intoxicating idea that he was becoming a god, or at least a demigod. He does not want that at all. All right. Last 3 points before we call it a day here. Again, more stuff with a hammer. The kids ask him, where do all these great things come from? The cars, the Jeep, the bridges, the hammer, all that stuff. And he said the Americans made it. And the Americans become sort of this prehistoric, pre-apocalyptic, godlike people, sort of the way that Americans and Europeans after the Dark Ages begin to look back on the Greeks and the Romans as the classical era, because they had civilization, and we still look back on them today. Isherwood says on 235, I am an American, right? The Americans built on this. I'm an American. The kids are not. The kids are, just running around doing bull dodging, okay? And it says there on 235, towards the bottom, he says, yes, naturally, you are an American. You have many strange knowledges which we simple ones do not have. You teach us reading and writing. You tell us tales about the world being round. They wouldn't understand that. You talk about numbers. You carry the hammer. Yes, it is plain that people like you made all the world, and you are merely one who lingers over from the old times. Yes, naturally, you are an American. If you notice the chapter, the last section is called The Last American. Finishing up today, chapter 6, Bob and Dick return, and they have a friend, and his name is Charlie. And Charlie is a bad boy. Okay? It says right away on 237, handsome, no doubt, in a way, a good companion. So the actions of the boys seem to satisfy him. But yes, Charlie was dirty. 238, Charlie was dirty, and from an inner reaction, Ish felt himself going on to think that Charlie must be in some way dirty inside. Right? There's a lot of that. They do not trust Charlie. Isherwood does not trust Charlie, and it comes to what this is the climactic moment of the book, in the trial of Charlie. Charlie begins to, he's just got a little too popular. Isherwood appears to be somewhat jealous. There's the whole scene where he stokes the fire to try to get Charlie to take off his jacket. When he finally does, he's sure that Charlie has a gun. That, again, is a no-no with the tribe and their society. They live free of those types of things. Isherwood even says he begins to lock his door for the first time in 22 years. He doesn't feel safe with Charlie. And then Charlie crosses the line. Charlie looks around and looks for a woman, and the only one that is of age and untaken is Evie. And Evie, as we've discussed before we left school, is mentally disabled. They don't go into exactly what's wrong with her, but she is not, she has some sort of special needs. And Charlie begins to hang out with her, and Isherwood fears that he will get her pregnant and they will have children who carry on this, whatever this special need happens to be. And it's a bit dark. It's definitely indicative of the age. He even discusses in chapter 7, Isherwood even considers, would it have been better had they killed Evie to even take the risk out of her possibly having a child and bringing more kids into the world that have this disability. That form of euthanasia, all right, you can put that in your notes, is, the Evie and euthanasia. They talked about maybe this is on 252 and 253. It would have been better, he had often thought, if they merely put a can of sweet ant poison out where she could get it, eat it, and die. Talks about how they've always kept her alive, and the boys always knew that she was taboo. Right? I hope everybody knows what taboo is, that you can't touch it. Right? And of course, Charlie is going to. This leads to the trial, and a very interesting trial, because 255, there's the confrontation with Charlie, and Isherwood is stood down by Charlie, and Isherwood has to lead sort of a revolt, a court in which they decide what to do with Charlie, because, as he points out, Charlie, he believes, on 258, is rotten inside as 10-day fish, diseases, Cupid's diseases, I mean. You might want to look up Cupid's diseases and put that in your notes and send it to me. He says Charlie's got them all right? So figure out what that is. Got a question there, Andrew? Yes. The question was, did Hitler do or engage in euthanasia in World War II? That is absolutely correct. First thing that he put down was mentally disabled, Down syndrome, crippled, multiple sclerosis, all those things. Anybody who could not contribute, they were executed. And then, of course, then he moved up the chain. We know they killed Catholic priests because they were leaders, killed educators because they were leaders, and then ultimately got to the goal that he wanted the most, which were the Jews. Great question, Andrew, because you brought me back to what I think is one of the most important points of the book, something, again, that you can include in your notes. Heinlein, as we read, was a fairly right-wing man, and his book showed that. He wrote about militarism, meritocracy. You start bringing that stuff up in your government classes, and guys like Mr. Jacobs get crazy, right? And we purposely tortured Mr. Jacobs all the time with those kinds of things. We would send him messages and so on and so forth. That's very hardcore to the right. But then remember, the funny thing about this hardcore right-wing guy, Robert Heinlein, he preached civil, racial, sexual, ethnic, and religious equality the same way that Martin Luther King would have, all for a different reason. As we learned, it was all based upon logic. So the idea of both the books is to show you that not everybody fits neatly into the box that we think of when it comes to our political views, our religious views, and any kind of view. And in a country with freedom like we have, it's pretty wide open. This book is written by a guy who is clearly environmental. He's clearly liberal in his views of interracial relationships. Hence M, she's black. There's a lot of little needling remarks he makes about race. He's very highly engaged in following science. as anti-religious, though anti-religious does not make you on the left at all, not whatsoever. But in our modern society, when we think of what party tries or caters to the most religious aspects of our culture, it's generally the right. The left is oftentimes they kind of push it to the side, not because they're anti or anything, just that's not our agenda. But as liberal as this book is, they do something that is not liberal at all. They try someone and execute them for a crime they have not yet committed. Now that is something that goes in the oligarchical countries of this world. That's North Korean, that's Chinese, that's Vladimir Putin, Russia. Oh, hi Vladdy, how you doing? All right, probably watching this. So that's how we shall end today. All right, unless there's any other questions, feel free to throw them out. But the last thing is the fact that they do put Charlie to death. You'll notice they execute him, and you guys should be finishing year 22 now. I ask you to have it done by tomorrow. They don't give you the execution. They don't give you the gory details and all of that. They have the trial, and then they move on. And as you're seeing in part 2, the aftermath of that. I'd like to come back on Friday or maybe, come back on Friday and do this again, and we'll discuss chapter 8 and the quick years. All right. And with that, I want you to send me a message after you guys get a chance to watch this via your email. The ultimate morality that's discussed here, or whether what they should do with him. Remember, they thought about banishment, or they thought about death. What is the reason why they didn't banish him? I'd like you to put that in your answer. And since there are no more questions, and my coffee's done, and I hope you like my flag that was sent to me in the mail recently, I will take my hammer, my Isherwood hammer, and I will get out of here. All right. I look forward to your emails. Spread the word that they need to watch the video.